All right, welcome folks. Today we're going to talk a little bit about risk management and emergency preparedness. So like how we can develop maybe some risk management strategies and putting plans in place to be prepared to deal with some of the emergencies that rarely but could arise in our yoga classes. Depending on where you teach, there might already be risk management and emergency protocols in place. So in your orientation, if you're teaching in a gym or some other facility, in your orientation, you'll usually be taken through those processes. If you're running your own classes, when you hire a venue, they'll often have all those protocols in place, and they'll take you through those processes in your orientation, show you everything that you need to know for venue safety, including, where are fire alarms, where are fire extinguishers, what's the exit door, where's the assembly point, those kinds of things. When you're running your own classes, it is up to you to have those plans in place, have them clearly outlined. And what kind of emergencies are we talking about? It could be things like someone having an allergic reaction, a medical or mental health emergency. It could be fires like inside the building or bushfires that are nearby. It could be a really bad storm, floods, a storm that's particularly affecting the building that you're teaching in. It could be an unknown person or a trespasser in the building. And because most of you are in Australia, it could be a snake or another dangerous animal. And if you're teaching outside, that includes like the bitey ants, bees, things like that. So just having some things in place to help you be prepared for managing those kinds of emergencies, because you're going to be the person in charge. So how can you prepare? You're going to train in first aid and CPR. You're going to need that to register as a yoga professional and to get insurance. So if you haven't done that yet, now is a great time to be doing that. And you're going to learn in your first aid training how to respond to injuries, allergies, illness, emergency situations, snake bites. With that first aid training, and I know some of you have done first aid training for years and years. I know I have as well. One of the things that I think is important when you do first aid training and in between recertifications is doing some mental rehearsal occasionally. Mental rehearsal is helpful because as the person in charge, you need to be able to be clear-headed and think about what steps need to be taken in a given situation. And some mental rehearsal, rehearsing those steps, will aid your confidence and your readiness to handle those kinds of situations. So that's something that I recommend. Often that's something that happens in your first aid classes. They get you to do some role playing on, who's going to call for emergency medical care, who's going to do CPR, that kind of thing. And that's something that you might just regularly run through in your mind. With these days being able to do your first aid and CPR online, there maybe is less of that kind of role playing. So it might be up to you to kind of run yourself through that on a regular basis. How else can you prepare? If you have a student who has a pre-existing medical condition that could be made worse by taking part in yoga, ideally they have medical clearance before attending your class. The medical clearance isn't just for liability's sake, it's so that someone's care team can say, sure, go to yoga, but be careful with these kinds of movements. Or tell your teacher, these movements need to be modified. If it's someone with high blood pressure, be careful about movements with your head below your heart, that kind of thing. So that they can get advice to practice safely, and you can get some advice for them to practice safely. So that's going to include people like high blood pressure, heart conditions, stroke, osteoporosis, rheumatoid arthritis, spinal conditions, any condition that could be made worse by a change in someone's movement practice. There's a risk. And so if you're in doubt, refer them back to their doctor. I know it's a pain to have to go to the doctor, but we want to keep people safe, and that's really important. Some students are contraindicated for vinyasa flow yoga, but they're welcome to join your restorative yoga class or your gentle yoga class or your chair yoga class. So you want to be really clear when you're sending them off to their care team what this yoga class entails. That might be worth putting in place, having a little template that you can send them back with. This is what we do in this yoga class. Are they okay to do that, right? And again, if in doubt, refer, right? If a student has an allergy or asthma or any condition that requires medical intervention, like an inhaler, an EpiPen, know where that medication is located during class. So, you know, in your classes, often in studios, there's like cubbies where people put all their gear. You might just mark off a couple of cubbies, maybe with a sticker or something. That's where the people who have emergency medical interventions, that's where they put their bags. So you know exactly where to go and get their medication if they need it. Or if you're teaching really big classes, maybe have them keep their bag next to them so that that is readily available for them should they need it. It's great if you can have a class sign-in, either on paper, a sign-in sheet, or if you're teaching in a space that has an app that runs the studio, like know who's in your class and a place where students can inform you if they've had a change in their health status. If a student requires emergency care, here's where we want to make sure, and I'm saying this from personal experience, here's where we want to make sure that we are acting on someone's emergency medical needs. The show must not go on. End your class. Don't let a person who's in medical distress leave the room. So end your class, remove all your other students to a safe area, call emergency services, stay with the student until those emergency services arrive. It's fine to end a class early if someone is in distress, right? It's the responsible thing to do. All your other students are going to understand. If you have a student in distress, whether that be medical distress, mental health distress, do not leave them on their own. Don't let them leave the class alone, okay? If they're more comfortable leaving the room, let them leave the room. Put your students in a safe posture. That might be child's pose. It might be Shavasana. Join the student outside. If they're in physical distress, call emergency services. If they're in emotional, mental distress, get them on the phone with someone, a family, a friend, or emergency services, right? Don't let them wander out alone in physical or mental health distress, and just carry on with your class, okay? In the case of a fire or that type of emergency, generally there's venue guidelines that you'll be following as to what's the exit route, what's the assembly point. I find that people have a hard time leaving their gear. So if it's possible, tell people, okay, we need to exit immediately, grab your phone, quickly walk out to the blah, blah, blah assembly point. That can sometimes be quicker than telling people to just leave, right? It can be really hard for people to leave their stuff. You want to make sure that you see everybody leave the venue. And this is where having a digital or paper sign-in sheet is really helpful. You can count heads at the assembly point, make sure everybody got out safely. If you're working with children or vulnerable people, have their guardian contact list available so that if that vulnerable person does require care or support, you're able to call up their guardian straight away, right? If you're working with vulnerable people, that's children, it's people with disability, that's the elderly. Like, it's really important that you take that duty of care very seriously and that you're able to contact someone so that they can support their person through whatever's happening. Ideally, and this isn't always within your control. If you're teaching for someone else, they handle all the admin of your class. But if you're running your own classes, I recommend having a section in your registration that allows people to inform you about things like allergies, about special needs. If you have a student with a service animal, you want to know that they're going to be bringing in their service animal so that you can inform other students that there'll be a service animal in the room so they can make informed choices. What you don't want is having someone rock up with their service animal and someone rock up with a severe allergy to that service animal at the same time. So you want to make sure that everyone's making informed choices about attending class. And while you're doing that, be clear about all the accessibility with your class. Are there stairs? Is there parking? Is there public transport to the location at the time of your class and after class ends? All of those things you want to really spell out to people so that they can make an informed choice about coming to class. And what can they expect from your class in terms of, air, use of touch, all those things, so that they can make that choice, what's best for them. And with COVID, tell your students about your COVID safety practices, remind students not to come to class if they're unwell, and, perhaps consider a change to your cancellation policy for illness while COVID is high in your area. If people are less likely to skip class if they're feeling unwell, if they know that they're going to get charged for that class. So I know it's, for those of you who are running your own classes, it's a pain. It can really affect your bottom line, but we don't want COVID to keep spreading around the community over and over again. So, if you're unwell, you can switch to another class later on in the month or whatever. Might be something that you consider in your class cancellation policy. For each class or each venue, you want to have a page. I usually have a folder. It's a little bit different for me because I teach yoga teacher training. They're long days. They're very intense. There's, a lot more can happen in those, 9 hours a day or whatever. But for each class or venue, I have a cover page that outlines what's the emergency number, because in Australia, even though I've lived in Australia for so long, I still have 911 in my brain when it comes to calling emergency services. So I have a cover page for each course that I'll show you here that reminds me to call 000, because I might have trouble with that. And it also tells me like the exact directions to the building and what door to enter, especially if it's a complex, like I teach a lot on a university campus. It's a complex place. So what door do they go in? What stairs do they go up? This way, I can hand this off to a student if there's an emergency. I can say, go call 000, here's the directions to the building, right? What you don't want in an emergency situation is that you've got a student calling for, you're handling the emergency, like that's where you need to be. You need to send another student off to call emergency services, and have them say, at the yoga studio, I don't know, it's near, the gluten-free bakery. Like, they might not know where they are. We often don't know where we are. So you want to make sure that there's specific directions to give to emergency services so that they can get to you and your student very quickly. So that's worth having. It's also, let me say, worth having if you're teaching in a lot of different venues. You're going to have a lot of different alarm codes to remember. You're going to have, how do I turn the heaters on and off? There's a lot of instructions that come with different venues. So just from a logistics perspective, it's great to have a cover sheet for each of the venues you use that has the emergency information, and maybe on the reverse side, it has all the details you need when you arrive at a venue to turn off the alarm and turn on the heaters and turn on the lights. Some venues can be really complex. So that just helps you and makes the running of your classes a lot smoother. Often our students think that all yoga is therapeutic. and they don't know that there are risks. So if you're teaching something that does have risks, then you maybe need to say that out loud. Like, if you've got high blood pressure, you know, instead of this, try this version, right? So that people have a little bit more information that this might not be the pose for you, right? In Australia, they're more and more requiring you to have specific training if you're going to work with specific populations. So if you're going to work with children, you have to have a children's yoga teacher training. If you're going to work with prenatal students, you have to have prenatal certification. You're not insured to teach to those populations without the training because they are higher risk groups. And certainly we want everyone to have access to yoga. We just want them to have safe access. So if you are going to work with vulnerable populations, you know, do those additional trainings so that you can better inform students about how to practice safely, and you can be better prepared to deal, excuse me, with any emergencies that may arise. Yeah. I hope that helps. And let me just reiterate, any confidential personal information that you gather from students, you are then responsible for keeping that information confidential, for keeping it safe, under lock and key, that other people can't access it. These days, a lot of the information we gather is not on paper. It's not physically being put in a file. It's digital. And again, that needs to be under safe digital storage. Okay, so that's important. I forget where we were at. So I think we were talking about having a page that outlines your emergency number, the location of your venue, what door they should come in, etc., so that you can hand that off to someone else, call emergency services. They can provide those details while you handle the emergency. So what are those emergency contacts? That's, you know, 000 or 911 or 999, depending on where you are. If someone's having a mental health emergency, there's Lifeline. There's a mental health helpline. There's the Heart team. Hang on. Yeah. I'm going to put these numbers in the chat. Because we have lots of folks in Canberra, last week we talked about the Heart team, the Access Mental Health team. That's specific for Canberra. But other than that, nationwide, we've got some numbers that you can call. If someone doesn't have a family or friend that they're able to call or willing to call, these are other numbers that you can get students onto. We've talked about additional training. If you plan to work with special populations, further training is required both for that special population and potentially in advanced first aid, in mental health first aid, or first aid for special populations. So first aid specific to children, first aid specific to the elderly, etc. That's recommended. And in some cases, it's going to be required. So it depends on where you're going to be teaching, in what state. If you're teaching in an institution, that training may be required. If you want to teach to special populations, talk to your insurance provider about what their requirements are in terms of training, certification, and in first aid training. So those are important. Having said all of this, your scope of practice is limited in dealing with people's healthcare crisis, whether that be a medical crisis or a mental health crisis. So when you encounter situations that you're not trained for, that you're not comfortable with, that are outside your scope of practice, you need to refer your students to a professional who has the training and expertise to best assist your student. So here's where your when in doubt, refer mantra is really useful. If someone's having an emotional crisis, a mental health crisis, it's not your job to be their counselor. You can't take them home with you. It's your job to get them in touch with someone from their care team, whether that be their family or friend, or get them in touch with a professional who can support them. Yes, you're the responsible person, but your scope to handle that responsibility is very limited. Your job is to get them access to someone who can help them. So that's worth noting, okay? For those of you who are feeling a little bit like, am I doing surgery on my students? No, you're not. You're just getting them on the phone with someone, or you're getting someone to come and deliver them medical care or mental health care. I know that people want to hear about circumstances, like what will this look like in my classes? So I've got some circumstances I'm open to sharing with. And again, note, things are a bit different for me because most of what I do now is yoga teacher training. So I'm teaching long days. They're usually 9 hours per day. It's a much more intense environment than a yoga class. So there's a lot more time for things to come up. And it's yoga teacher training. So people are less inclined to miss a day than in a yoga class. So people are more likely to come injured or unwell. And they do need regular reminders for self-care and for, not attending if they're unwell or injured, or modifying their movements. So my situation's a little bit different than when you're teaching general yoga classes, but here are some circumstances if you want to hear some things that can come up. A big storm. I was teaching at Canberra Uni, and it blew some windows out in the right near where we were practicing yoga. And I was leading a meditation at the time. So I just asked everyone to move away from the windows. Like the windows, they're really old and they were really shaking. And I got nervous about that. People lying in meditation and big high windows above them are like, could they fall in? So during the meditation, I just asked everybody to move away from those windows. And at the end of the meditation, at the end of the storm, we saw that a bunch of windows had been blown out, not in our room, but in the room adjacent. So that's something that can happen. A building issue can occur in class. And I'm storm phobic, so this is not the first time, I should say, that I've had students move away from the windows during a storm. And that's just because I come from a place where there's tornadoes. So when there's that kind of storm, I have a lot more readiness. But in this situation, it was a good call. One year there were bushfires nearby, so I had to stop class. And again, we're there for a whole day, so this is maybe a little bit different, but I had to stop class and make an announcement. There's bushfires nearby. If you need to go, you should go. Like if your route to get home might be compromised, if you've got kids at home, if you've got pets or livestock outdoors, you might need to go handle that situation. Getting those alerts on your phone is really useful. So being signed up to emergency notifications about fires, floods, things like that, that can be really useful, so you can be informing students, especially if you live in an area where access can be cut off easily by fires and floods and things like that. The guy I told you about, for those of you who were with us last week when we talked about class management, the guy I told you about last week who I was late calling for an ambulance for him, he did have a pre-existing condition that he didn't tell me about. When the paramedics arrived, they said, hey, didn't we just get you from the golf course last week? And he was like, yeah, that was me. So he already had been in hospital for this injury, and he hadn't told me about it. A lot of times people won't tell you stuff. They won't tell you about their injuries. They won't tell you about their past history with movement or exercise. And they won't tell you about an issue that could be made worse by yoga, either because they don't think it could be made worse by yoga, or they don't want to share that information with you, or they feel embarrassed. There's lots of reasons that people won't tell you things. You have to assume as a teacher that there's information that you don't have. And that's why you need to get medical professionals in as quickly as possible to handle things. okay? Because you won't know. I tell a story regularly about, you can be halfway through class and a student says, oh, that stretch was pretty deep for me since I had that hip replacement last week. And you're like, what? Why are you in my class? Why didn't you tell me? I tell this story and we all have a laugh. And a few years ago, there was a student in class. When I told that story, she was like, oh, Heather, she's so dramatic, like as if that's going to happen. And that did happen to her. Early on in her teaching career, she was in the midst of teaching a class and a student said, oh, my physio would be so mad if he knew I was in yoga because I've just had a hip replacement. And she was, what are you doing in my class? Get out. I don't think she said get out. But, like students either don't know or prefer not to know, or know but are doing it anyway. And there's only so much responsibility that you can take for that, right? So you will not always be informed. You will not always understand what's happening for someone. And that's why making a quick call to emergency services is your best bet if you're concerned about somebody. Assumptions can be dangerous, right? Students might be, feeling dizzy or having trouble breathing and tell you it's nothing. Oh, it's nothing. I'm just tired. Oh, it's nothing. I've just been anxious lately. If in doubt, get them help, right? Don't make assumptions. You don't want to embarrass someone. You don't want to cost them huge amounts of money by calling an ambulance that they might have to pay out of pocket for. Like, I understand that there's issues there, but we want to keep people safe and keep them alive. So if in doubt, end your class, get into conversation with that person, say, I'm really concerned. I really think that we should make a call here, or can I walk you over to your doctor, etc. Like, we want to make sure that we keep people safe. I want to say, how often does this happen? Not often. You may never, ever deal with an emergency situation in your yoga classes. You just want to be prepared should something happen, right? Particularly on the weather side of things, those are easy things for you to be alert to and be prepared to handle, right? It doesn't take much effort to be aware of, I've got a class tonight and we've got a risk of flooding. Should I run my class or not? Like, is this something that is reasonable for me to do? If I run my class and there's flooded roads, are people gonna be in strife on the way home from yoga class? Like, those are easy decisions for you to make. I want to keep people safe. Here in Canada, if there's a snowstorm, we cancel classes because you don't want people out on the road, or at least you tell people class is still going on, but if it's not safe for you to come, you can save this class. You won't be paying for this class. You can save this class for later in the month. You want to keep people safe from basic things, right? So yeah, that's really easy. That kind of thing, like, those are easy decisions to make. If in doubt, cancel your class. If in doubt, send everyone a message. I'm concerned about the roads, that kind of thing. So yeah. Ants in the park. Yeah. I was teaching some lunchtime corporate classes in Brisbane in the park, which I thought was lovely, but there was ants that were biting people. You can't keep a class going when people are being bit by ants, right? You've either got to move locations or change the way you're structuring a class like that. No one's going to be looking forward to going to yoga and being bit by ants the whole time, right? What other things have happened? Several times I've been teaching in different venues where people have wandered in, and in some cases made people feel really uncomfortable, or have been starting to look like they might be rifling through things. So now I have a policy about locking doors depending on the venue. From a trauma sensitivity perspective, I think it's important to inform students if you're going to lock the door. So I'm going to be locking the door. That's to keep us all safe and secure. Here's how you unlock the door if you need to, so that people know they can exit if they need to. You might have someone who's really uncomfortable being locked into a room. So you want them to know that they can unlock it should the need arise. That's really important. So again, how often will these things happen? Not often. But you do want to be prepared. One of the things, we sort of touched on this last week, one of the things that I've experienced, so that's why I'm concerned about this, is that I never received any training. Back in the old days of yoga teacher training, we didn't receive any training on what emergencies could arise, on, you know, class management, on risk management, none of those things. So we did our first aid training, and then we were supposed to somehow figure out how to do that as a leader. So there was no training for like what happens when you're in a leadership position and there's an emergency. So these days we kind of want to do better. You can look to your registering body, whether it be Yoga Australia or Yoga Alliance. They have lots of information for you on best practices, your scope of practice, what to do in emergencies. If you're still a student, you can get, I should mention, a student membership with Yoga Australia. So you have access to all of that information. If you're interested in that, drop me an email. I'll send you all the details, so that you have access to all of that information and all of those resources, which can really help you in putting plans in place and hopefully put you at ease a little bit after this discussion, that people have thought through some of the issues that might come up and how you might handle them. You can also talk to your insurance company. They'll have resources and checklists and things that can support you. They don't want anyone to get hurt in your class either, right? So they'll have some resources that they can provide you with. When it comes to your insurance company, you know, it's really important that you inform them of everything to do with your teaching practice, whether you're teaching face-to-face, you're teaching live online, you're teaching recorded online classes, you're teaching outdoors, you're teaching from your home. All of that information you want to be telling your insurance company so that they can provide you with cover for all of those things, and so that should an event arise, they will cover you, right? If you're doing something you haven't informed them of and someone gets hurt, they won't provide insurance cover for that. Not that people get sued a lot in yoga, I should say. I'm probably not up to date on this, but there aren't a lot of circumstances where I hear about yoga teachers or movement teachers or studios getting sued. There are circumstances where, like, going outside your scope of practice. So recommending or selling things that are outside your scope of practice, that might be supplements or oils or diets or other products that can cause real harm. And people get sued for that. And they should. You shouldn't recommend things that are outside your scope of practice. Mostly this is in the US, because that's, Americans really like suing. But they have to pay for healthcare, which is one of the reasons that they're not just like bad people. They don't get free healthcare. So if something happens to them, they need money to get better. Even in a place like Canada or Australia, if you've ever been ill or injured, you know that you're going to be out of pocket, that it can take a lot of work and a lot of money to get better. So that's why someone might need to draw from your insurance company. But in the US, the most common things are related to things like negligence. There was an instance where a studio was really crowded and the teacher was having everyone kick up into handstands against the wall, but there wasn't enough walls and there was a window and someone kicked up and smashed the window and, like, I think fell out of the window. And that's just like, that's basic. Don't have people kick up into a handstand against glass. Like, you know, there was another instance with glass where the studio was heated so hot that it melted the glue that held the mirrors to the wall, and a mirror fell on someone. So those are the kind of things that generally we see lawsuits coming up. Adjustments, so adjustments that injure people, or adjustments where it's really outside your scope of practice to provide that hands-on adjustment or deepening assist. Like you don't have the training for it, this isn't the environment for it, this isn't the student for it, whatever. Or adjustments where there's no consent. So those are things we don't want to be doing, right? And most commonly slip and falls. So, you know, sweaty floors, wet floors being the most common issue in that area. So when you get insurance, you're going to have, there's going to be two components to your insurance. There's going to be public liability. That's your slip and fall insurance. And then there's going to be professional indemnity. So when you buy an insurance policy, it's going to have both of those things in it. The public liability is if someone walks into the studio and someone spilled their water and they slip on that water and fall, they're covered by the public liability element of your insurance. The professional indemnity is if it's something due to negligence or poor teaching on your part. That's the section that is covering that issue. So if you have people kicking up onto walls and they smash their foot through a wall or something, right? So just in general, in Australia, to hire a venue, you need $20 million public liability. The venue is going to require that in order for you to hire the venue. And then generally professional indemnity starts at $5 million. So that's what you're going to be looking for from your insurance policy. In your training portal, there's information on the insurance companies in Australia that I recommend. If you want me to send you a quick overview of those, I'm happy to do that. And you do want to have insurance. Insurance protects you as a teacher and it protects your students. Again, if someone gets hurt in my class, I want there to be money there for them to get better, right? That's why I'm going to have insurance. Also, if someone gets hurt in my class and I don't have insurance and they need money to get better, they're going to have to take my money. And I don't have enough of that to be spreading around. So I want to have insurance to cover that. Have I been negligent in teaching? Yes. Yes, I have. Incidents that I remember and incidents that probably I didn't even notice, but that I was responsible for. This I'm constantly learning. And on reflection, a lot of the times where I feel like I was negligent as a teacher were times where I was trying something out that I hadn't really done the risk management research on. I hadn't really thought it through. Or I got excited and let students encourage me, or I just got excited and pushed into increasing intensity or offering pose options that were too high risk for that group or that space or that environment. So those are the things that come to mind, things that I just hadn't thought through, that I got excited about it and thought, let's do this. And I hadn't really like plotted out, do I have the space for this? Are these the students for this? Do we have enough walls, right? Those are the times when I reflect back, and a lot of hands-on adjustments that I think could have hurt people, that I learned from my teachers, that were applied to me, that were part of my tradition, that I would no longer use today. If you do have an incident in class, I highly recommend completing an incident report straight away. It doesn't necessarily have to be reported to your insurance company, especially if it's something minor and the student doesn't have an injury or a complaint. But I think it's helpful to note down all the circumstances as soon as you can, while they're fresh in your mind, while you can remember them, so that you can report to your insurance company if need be, so that they can get on the case and start providing some support to that student. You can get an incident report template from your insurance provider. You can probably find lots of them online that can just guide you through mentally recollecting, here are all the things that happened, right? Just before you forget or your memory gets clouded. Yeah. Have I ever had an injury reported to the insurance company? No. No, no one's ever been injured to that extent in my class that I'm aware of. I have had injuries in my class. Years ago, it's probably 15 years ago now. I remember I was still teaching shoulder stand in those days, but I was providing a lot of cautionary guidance about shoulder stand. You know, in these circumstances, you're not going to want to use shoulder stand. Here's a great movement that gives you all the benefits without the risks, blah, blah, blah. And this woman still did shoulder stand. She didn't look like she was having a great shoulder stand. And I went over, it was a really small class. I had lots of room to move over and help. I was like, are you doing okay here? You know, there's an alternative posture for this. And she was like, no, I'm great. And then the next week she came back in, she said, yeah, I got hurt doing my shoulder stand. And my chiropractor's mad and says I shouldn't do yoga. And I was like, yeah, like you didn't look comfortable. I'm sorry I wasn't more supportive of guiding out of the pose. And she was like, no, I knew what I was doing. I knew I shouldn't. I did it anyway. You know, maybe my neck's going to hurt for a couple of weeks. Like, it's no big deal. And I thought, like, what is my burden there? She's a grown woman. She's making choices. She was advised of the reasons why she might take caution. She was advised of the risks in the pose. She knew she was uncomfortable. I offered her an option. She didn't take it. It's kind of on her, right? To make those movement choices. My hope is that since then, I've done a better job of informing students that not all yoga is therapeutic and that there are risks. And why would you hurt yourself doing yoga? It's the last place. It isn't soccer. It's not the rugby finals. There's no reason to risk your health or well-being for yoga. So I hope I do a better job of that. But when I look back on that circumstance, I don't know that I could have done differently. And she was basically in agreement with me on that. Okay, that's all I want to say about being prepared for emergencies. And, you know, being prepared with some risk management strategies in your classes. I want to reiterate, for those of you who are feeling really nervous right now, these circumstances are very rare. You just want to be prepared to support students, to help them out, to make sure they get the care they need should something arise. Some of these things are basic human precautions. If there's a snowstorm or a flood or a bushfire, cancel your class, right? Getting out of this mindset of the show must go on, I think, is one of the most useful things to your risk management. And, you know, remember, I've been teaching for 25 years. I teach a lot of hours each week. So there's a higher likelihood some things are going to happen in a class for someone like me versus someone who's teaching a few hours a week. If you're teaching to vulnerable people, do your research, do additional training so that you're ready to support the unique needs of those vulnerable students. And otherwise, if you haven't already, book your first aid and CPR training. You're going to need that to get registered and get insurance. And not only be helpful in an emergency in your yoga classes, but now you're going to be useful in an emergency anywhere around you. At the shops, in a traffic jam, at a concert, right? So those are some things to think about. I hope that's been useful. If you do have questions arise, you need some resources, you need phone numbers, you want templates, etc., just let me know. I'm happy to provide those if I have them. Any final questions before we wrap up? Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks to those of you who joined me live. Hello to those of you who are listening to the recording. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you all next week. Ta.